On our third wedding anniversary, in front of exactly 126 guests, and under a $38,000 crystal chandelier we couldn't actually afford when we first got married, my husband raised a champagne glass and announced he was divorcing me. He didn't shout. He didn't tremble. He simply smiled, calm, polished, almost bored, as if he were announcing a change in catering. And then he told me I had exactly 48 hours to leave the house. If you've ever watched your entire life get erased in under 30 seconds, you know there's a strange silence that follows. Not outside inside you, like the air gets vacuumed out of your lungs. Before I tell you how I ended up standing there, holding a half-empty glass of champagne, while my husband calmly dismantled my existence in front of a ballroom full of investors, colleagues, and family, I need you to do one thing. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you signed something without reading the fine print, hit like and tell me in the comments what's the worst betrayal you've ever experienced. Because what happened to me didn't start that night. It started 6 months earlier, the day I signed away 51% of my company. My name is Lauren Michelle Carter. I was 32 years old then, living in Austin, Texas, and I owned a fast-growing logistics analytics startup called Fleet Access. Or at least, I thought I did. I built Fleet Access from scratch at 27. I wrote the first version of the software myself, while working double shifts as a rideshare driver. I maxed out 2 credit cards and borrowed $18,000 from my younger brother, Ethan Carter. No investors, no trust fund, no family backing, just spreadsheets, caffeine, and 5 years of sleeping on a futon. Then, Daniel entered my life. Daniel James Whitmore. He was 38 when we met, a venture consultant with connections in 3 major VC firms and the kind of confidence that made everyone else in the room feel slightly underdressed. He told me he believed in my vision. He told me he believed in me. Most importantly, he knew exactly where my weak spots were. He didn't try to impress me with money. He impressed me with patience. He learned how overwhelmed I was managing product development, investor relations, and operations alone. He would sit next to me at 2 a.m. while I debugged code and quietly bring me food. He never once tried to control anything in the beginning. He just made himself indispensable. Looking back now, that's the first red flag most people miss. Not aggression, not dominance, dependence. Within a year, Daniel had introduced Fleet Access to 2 angel investors and helped us secure a $2.4 million Series A funding round. And 6 months after that, he proposed. We got married in a small outdoor ceremony. Nothing flashy. Just 60 people, barbecue catering, and a live band that cost $4,200. He told me we were partners in everything, life and business. I believed him. 2 years into the marriage, Fleet Access was valued at $26 million. That's when Daniel brought up the restructuring. He said investors were concerned that the company looked too founder-dependent. He said, if anything ever happened to me, there was no leadership continuity. He said it was standard practice for a CEO's spouse, especially one with business experience, like him, to hold controlling shares for stability. I remember the exact date he presented the documents, March 14th. He had printed them on heavy, cream-colored paper. The transfer agreement moved 51% ownership from me to him. Temporary, he said. Just for optics. He even laughed and said, you know, I'd never do anything without you, right? I asked him one question. Do I need a lawyer to review this? He smiled, the same calm smile he had the night he announced the divorce. And he said, we're married, Lauren. There's no you versus me. I signed. No negotiation. No independent counsel. Nothing. That was the second red flag. But here's what no one talks about. The real reason smart women sign bad papers isn't stupidity. It's exhaustion. I was working 70-hour weeks. I trusted him, and I wanted one area of my life where I didn't have to be on guard. So I signed, and for 3 months afterward, nothing changed. Daniel acted the same. He was attentive, supportive, still introduced me as the genius behind Fleet Axis, which made what happened on our anniversary feel even more surreal. The ballroom was inside the Hilton downtown. We'd invited investors, employees, and both our families. I remember thinking that night felt strangely formal. Daniel insisted on handling the guest list himself. He also insisted I wear a white dress, not something I found odd until later. At 8:17 p.m., he tapped a spoon against his glass. Everyone turned toward him. He placed his hand lightly on my shoulder, the way someone might steady an object they were about to remove. Then he said the words that rewired my entire life. Tonight marks 3 years of marriage and the end of our professional partnership. People laughed at first. They thought it was a joke. Then he continued, as majority shareholder of Fleet Axis, I've decided to initiate leadership restructuring. Effective immediately, Lauren is no longer CEO. And personally, I'm filing for divorce. The laughter died instantly. You could hear someone drop a fork. I didn't react right away. Not because I was calm, because my brain literally couldn't process the speed at which everything was happening. He kept speaking. Cool, methodical. As part of the settlement, Lauren will vacate the marital residence within 48 hours. That's when the murmuring started. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Every major investor we'd invited already knew. They weren't shocked. They weren't confused. They were watching me, like spectators waiting to see how the main character would react. Daniel leaned close to my ear and whispered something no one else could hear. 3 quiet words. You signed it. And that's when I realized something far worse than losing my marriage or my company. Because 6 months earlier, when I signed those papers, I hadn't just given him control of Fleet Axis. I had unknowingly given him something else. Something that would take me weeks to even discover. And when I finally did, it explained why he looked so confident that night. It explained why the investors weren't surprised. And it explained why he believed I had absolutely no way to fight back. 2 days after the anniversary party, exactly 52 hours after Daniel Whitmore gave me a public eviction deadline, I was sitting on the floor of a 480 square foot furnished sublet apartment on East Riverside Drive, staring at a legal envelope that had arrived by overnight courier. The return address read Whitmore and Hale, Corporate Law, Daniel's firm. Inside was a stack of documents nearly an inch thick. At the top, a formal notice terminating my role as CEO of Fleet Axis, effective immediately. At the bottom, a clause that made my hands go cold. It stated that under the restructuring agreement I'd signed 6 months earlier, I had also waived my right to vote on any board decisions for a period of 5 years. 5 years. That meant I couldn't challenge him internally. I couldn't block any actions. I couldn't even access certain company financial records anymore. I sat there for a long time before I noticed something else. A smaller envelope tucked inside the packet. No letterhead, no branding, just my name, written in neat block letters. Inside was a single USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Plug it in immediately, or assume it was some kind of trap? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I still question that decision sometimes. I didn't plug it in right away. Instead, I called the only person I trusted enough to ask for advice. My younger brother, Ethan Carter. Ethan was 29, a forensic accountant working for a mid-sized audit firm in Dallas. He had helped me track our early expenses when Fleet Axis was still just spreadsheets and late-night invoices. He also had a habit of seeing patterns other people missed. He picked up on the second ring. I didn't say hello. I just said Daniel removed me as CEO. There was a pause. Then Ethan asked quietly, Did you sign anything without a lawyer present? I swallowed. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. Lauren, how much control did you give him? 51%. He exhaled slowly. That's not restructuring, he said. That's a takeover. I pressed my fingers against my temples. I know that now. Then I told him about the USB drive. Ethan didn't hesitate. Don't open it on your personal laptop, he said immediately. Bring it to a secure machine. It could be evidence or malware. Evidence. The word lingered, because until that moment, I had been thinking of everything as a betrayal, personal, emotional, humiliating. But Ethan framed it differently, as something deliberate, calculated, possibly illegal. That was the first time a different kind of clarity started to settle in. Cold, sharp, not emotional, strategic. The next morning, I drove to Dallas. 3 hours of highway, where I replayed every conversation I'd had with Daniel over the past year. Every time he'd asked for documents. Every time he'd insisted on streamlining communication with investors. Every time he'd told me not to worry about the legal details. By the time I arrived at Ethan's office building, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't crying anymore. I wasn't even angry yet. I was analyzing. Ethan worked after hours to access a secure workstation. We sat side by side as he plugged in the USB drive. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared on the screen. The name of the folder was a date, October 3rd. 3 months before I signed the share transfer. Ethan opened it. Inside were dozens of files, emails, meeting recordings, financial projections, and one document labeled simply Acquisition Strategy. Ethan clicked it. The first line made my stomach twist. Objective secure. Controlling ownership of Fleet Access prior to Series B funding, round projected valuation, $60, 70 million. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. Ethan kept scrolling. There were timelines, steps, contingency plans, and Daniel's name was listed as the lead strategist. This wasn't a spontaneous betrayal. It was a long-term plan, months, maybe years in the making. But the part that made my hands tremble wasn't the strategy itself. It was the list of participants, because Daniel hadn't been working alone. 3 names appeared under investor coordination. 2 of them belonged to venture capital partners I knew well. The third name I recognized instantly. Margaret Ellen Whitmore, Daniel's mother, a corporate attorney who specialized in hostile takeovers. That's when something clicked in my memory. The night before I signed the share transfer agreement, Daniel had insisted we attend a private dinner at his parents' house. His mother had asked unusually detailed questions about Fleet Access governance. At the time, I thought she was just being curious. Now I realized she had been verifying her strategy. I felt a sudden rush of heat behind my eyes. Not from sadness, from humiliation, because they hadn't just outmaneuvered me, they had studied me. They knew exactly how my trust worked, and they used it. Ethan kept scrolling through the files until he stopped abruptly. Lauren, he said quietly, you need to see this. He opened an audio file. It was a recording of a meeting. Daniel's voice filled the room. Calm, confident, unmistakable. He was speaking to someone whose voice was partially muffled, but recognizable. One of our investors, Daniel said clearly. She'll sign. She's exhausted, and she still believes we're partners. Once we secure majority control, removing her will be straightforward. I couldn't breathe for a moment, not because it surprised me, but because hearing it out loud, hearing how certain he had been stripped away the last illusion that any part of this had been accidental. It was premeditated, cold, precise. Ethan muted the recording. You understand what this is, right? He asked. I nodded slowly. Proof. Yes, he said, but not enough yet. I looked at him. What do you mean? He leaned back, eyes steady. This shows intent, he said. But to fight him legally, we need to find out what he gained beyond shares. Beyond shares. The phrase echoed in my mind, because suddenly I remembered something else. something I dismissed at the time as routine paperwork. 2 weeks after I signed the transfer agreement, Daniel had asked me to sign another set of documents. He said they were standard board compliance forms. I had signed those too, without reading closely. At the time, I didn't think twice. But now, a cold realization started creeping in. Because if those documents were connected to this strategy, then Daniel hadn't just taken my company. He may have positioned me to take the fall for something else entirely. And the moment that possibility fully formed in my mind, my phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. I answered. A calm male voice said, "Miss Carter, this is Special Agent Daniel Reeves with the SEC Enforcement Division. We need to speak with you regarding an investigation into financial irregularities at Fleet Axis." My blood went cold because in that instant, I understood why Daniel had looked so confident when he whispered, "You signed it." And I realized this wasn't just a divorce. This was a setup. And somehow, I had already been placed at the center of it. 3 weeks after my husband publicly humiliated me in front of 126 guests, I was sitting in a federal office building at exactly 9:02 a.m. across a gray metal table from 2 SEC enforcement agents who had a file on me that was thicker than my entire divorce paperwork. Agent Daniel Reeves didn't look intimidating. He looked patient. The kind of patient that comes from already knowing the answers. He slid a folder across the table. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "before we begin, you should understand this is a formal inquiry. You are not under arrest, but you are considered a primary subject in an ongoing investigation." Primary subject. Not witness. Not victim. Subject. The word felt heavier than anything Daniel had said at that anniversary party. I kept my hands folded so they wouldn't shake. "What investigation?" I asked. Agent Reeves opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside were printed bank statements, internal transaction logs, and something I recognized immediately. My electronic signature on dozens of authorization forms. Reeves tapped one page. "These documents authorize a series of capital transfers totaling $11.8 million, he said. Funds were moved from Fleet Axis accounts into a holding entity registered in Delaware called Whitmore Strategic Holdings. My throat tightened. I had never seen that company name before. He continued, voice neutral. These transfers occurred over a 4-month period. Each authorization bears your digital signature as CEO. I stared at the documents. Every signature was real. But I had no memory of approving any of those transactions. For a moment, I couldn't speak because a terrifying thought was forming, one that made the room feel suddenly smaller. If you were in my seat, I want you to think about this honestly. What would you say first? Would you try to defend yourself? Or would you realize the evidence already looks airtight? Because that's exactly what it felt like. Airtight. Agent Reeves watched me carefully. "Miss Carter," he said, "can you explain why nearly $12 million were transferred under your authority to an entity connected to your husband?" I swallowed slowly. "I didn't authorize those transfers," I said. He didn't react. He simply asked the next question. "Did you ever sign compliance or board governance documents presented by Mr. Whitmore within the last year?" My stomach dropped. The second set of papers. The ones Daniel told me were routine. "Yes," I admitted quietly. Reeves nodded once. "That aligns with our timeline." He pulled out another document. This one looked different. Legal language, dense, and at the top, in bold, delegation of financial authority. My vision blurred slightly as I read. The document granted Daniel Whitmore full operational control over corporate financial transactions under my executive oversight, meaning, technically, the transfers had been authorized through him, but legally executed under my name. He had created a perfect shield, one where he controlled the actions, but I held the liability. I felt something inside me crack, not emotionally, strategically, because in that moment, I understood the full architecture of his plan. The share transfer wasn't the endgame. It was the foundation. The real objective was to position me as the scapegoat for financial misconduct before the Series B funding round. If regulators found fraud, I would be the one facing charges, not him. Agent Reeves leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, "we need to ask you directly. Were you aware of these financial movements at the time they occurred?" I held his gaze. "No." He studied my face for several seconds. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you believe Mr. Whitmore acted without your knowledge?" The question was simple, but answering it carried risk. If I accused Daniel outright, without evidence, I could look like I was deflecting. But if I stayed silent, I looked complicit. So I chose the only option that was true. I believe I said carefully that I signed documents I trusted my husband to handle honestly. And those documents were used in ways I did not understand at the time. Agent Reeves didn't write anything down. He just watched me. And after a long moment, he said quietly, "That is consistent with a pattern we've seen before." A pattern. That word hit differently, because it meant this wasn't just about me. "Pattern?" I asked. He exchanged a glance with the second agent. Then Reeves spoke again. "Whitmore Strategic Holdings has been connected to 2 prior investigations involving executive spouses relinquishing control before financial irregularities surfaced." My heartbeat slowed, not from fear, from something colder, recognition. Daniel hadn't just done this to me. He had done it before. The agent closed the folder. "For now," he said, "you are not being charged, but we will continue monitoring your involvement. Do not leave the state without notifying us." He stood signaling the meeting was over. But before I could gather my things, he added one more sentence. "Miss Carter, if you have information that suggests you were manipulated or misled, now would be the time to provide it." I nodded slowly, because I did have something. The USB drive, the acquisition strategy, the recordings, but I didn't hand them over, not yet. And if you're wondering why, ask yourself this: would you trust the system immediately after learning how carefully someone had engineered your downfall? Or would you make absolutely certain you understood every piece of the game first? I walked out of that building feeling something very different from despair. Not hope, not relief, clarity. Because Daniel had made one critical mistake. He believed I would react emotionally. He believed I would panic, defend beg, or collapse. But instead, for the first time since the anniversary party, I became very, very quiet. And that night, sitting alone in my tiny apartment, I opened the USB drive again and began reading every file carefully. Not as a victim, as an analyst. That's when I found something Daniel never expected me to notice. Buried inside one of the investor communication threads was a spreadsheet labeled simply, Phase 3, Exit Protection. At first glance, it looked like routine funding projections. But one column didn't match any financial category. It listed dates, future dates. Next to each date was a short phrase: media exposure, regulatory filing, final leadership transition. And at the bottom of the list, a date exactly 6 weeks away. Next to it were 3 words that made my pulse slow into something dangerously calm. Public announcement event. That's when I realized something chilling. Daniel's plan wasn't finished. The anniversary party had only been phase 1. And whatever he intended to do next, he had already scheduled it. 6 weeks from now, at an event I hadn't even heard about yet. 4 days after the SEC interview, at exactly 6:43 a.m., while I was drinking stale coffee in my 480-square-foot sublet and calculating how long my remaining $18,200 in personal savings would last, I received an email that confirmed Daniel Whitmore's plan was moving exactly on schedule. The subject line read, "Fleet Axis, Series B launch, event, executive invitation." It was addressed to me, not because I was still part of the company, because my presence was required. The event was scheduled for 6 weeks, from the date listed in the spreadsheet I'd found on the USB drive. Location: the Four Seasons Ballroom, Austin. Guest list: investors, media, major clients, and city officials. Attendance expected: over 300 people. And at the bottom of the email was a single line that made my fingers go cold. Formal leadership announcement to be delivered by Daniel J. Whitmore. This was it. Phase 3, the final stage of his plan. He wasn't just removing me privately. He was preparing to erase me, publicly and permanently. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, because the realization settling into my mind wasn't panic. It was something far more unsettling: predictability. Daniel wasn't improvising. He was following a script. And if he was following a script, that meant it could be anticipated, studied, disrupted. But at that moment, I didn't yet know how. If you had only 6 weeks before someone destroyed your reputation in front of the entire business world, what would you focus on first? Clearing your name, or understanding exactly what they planned to accuse you of? Because that question defined everything that came next. I called Ethan. He answered immediately. "I assume you saw the invitation," he said. I frowned. "How did you?" "It's already circulating among financial networks," he replied. "Investors are treating it like a major leadership transition announcement." I swallowed. "So it's real." "Oh, it's very real," he said quietly. "And Lauren, there's something else." My chest tightened. "What?" I ran deeper background checks on Whitmore Strategic Holdings. I straightened in my chair. "What did you find?" A pause. Then he said something that made the room feel suddenly colder. "That company isn't just a holding entity. It's structured as a liability sink." I closed my eyes briefly, meaning exactly what I feared. If regulators determined fraud occurred, Ethan continued, anyone listed as the signing executive, which is you, becomes the primary legal target. The holding company shields Daniel and the investors. A perfect trap, not just financially, legally, reputationally. I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me. Not emotional exhaustion, strategic fatigue, because every new piece of information revealed how far ahead Daniel had been planning. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had engineered a system designed to make fighting back nearly impossible. I pressed my hand against my forehead. "So what happens at the Series B event?" I asked quietly. Ethan didn't hesitate. "They'll announce leadership changes. Then they'll disclose financial irregularities tied to prior executive management." Silence filled the line. "They're going to publicly blame me," I said. "Yes," he answered. "And if they do it first, before regulators finalize their findings, public perception will lock in." That was the real battlefield, not the courtroom, not the SEC. Reputation. Because in business, once you're labeled as someone involved in financial misconduct, recovery can take decades, if it happens at all. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. 6 weeks, 42 days, just enough time to prepare something, but not enough to make mistakes. And then Ethan said something unexpected. "Lauren, there's one advantage you still have." I blinked. "What?" "They think you're defeated." I didn't respond immediately, because he was right. Daniel believed I was isolated, financially weakened, and legally vulnerable, which meant he wasn't expecting resistance. And unexpected resistance is the most dangerous kind. Later that afternoon, I drove past the house Daniel and I used to share. A modern glass and steel property we'd purchased for $1.7 million 2 years earlier. Technically, it was now his. Seeing it from the street felt strangely detached, like looking at a photograph from someone else's life. But something caught my attention immediately. There were 3 unfamiliar cars parked outside, luxury black sedans, corporate plates, investors, or lawyers. Daniel was meeting with them at home. That wasn't his usual practice. He preferred neutral offices, private conference rooms. The fact that he was holding strategy sessions at the house meant something important. He felt safe there, comfortable, certain. That certainty stirred something quiet inside me. Not anger, not pain, something sharper. Focus. Because certainty breeds carelessness, and carelessness creates openings. As I sat there watching from across the street, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. Something small, seemingly insignificant at the time, but now potentially critical. 2 months before the anniversary party, Daniel had installed a new home network system. He said it was for security upgrades. He had insisted on handling the installation himself, no outside technicians. I hadn't questioned it then, but now a slow realization began forming. Because Daniel Whitmore was meticulous. He documented everything, recorded meetings, archived communications, tracked conversations. If he had installed a private network system at home, there was a high probability it wasn't just for security. It was for monitoring. And if that system existed, it might contain something he never expected anyone else to access. The thought made my pulse steady into something dangerously calm. Because for the first time, since all of this began, I saw a possible path. Not a clear one, not yet, but a direction. And that night, sitting alone in my small apartment, I opened my laptop and began researching something I had never imagined needing to understand. Residential network data retention systems. Because if Daniel had stored anything there, any conversations, any internal communications, any recordings, it could be the first piece of evidence that moved me from defense to offense. And what I discovered within the first hour of research made my breath slow. Because according to the system model Daniel had installed, data backups were automatically uploaded to a remote cloud server every 7 days, meaning somewhere outside his direct control, there might be a complete digital record of everything he thought was private, including conversations he never expected me to hear. And the next scheduled backup date was only 9 days away. 9 days after I discovered Daniel's home network backup system at exactly 2:11 a.m. with my laptop battery down to 14% and my savings account balance sitting at $17,643. I finally understood something that changed the entire direction of my thinking. I wasn't trying to prove Daniel had betrayed me. That part was already obvious. I needed to prove something far more specific. Intentional fraud, because without that, everything else, the takeover, the divorce, the humiliation, would remain legally permissible, cruel, unethical, but still lawful. And Daniel knew that. He had designed his plan around the difference between betrayal and criminal liability. Ethan sat across from me at his dining table, surrounded by documents, printouts, and open laptops. For 3 days straight, we had analyzed every file from the USB drive, every timestamp, every financial trail, every communication thread. And the deeper we looked, the clearer one pattern became. Daniel had insulated himself from direct responsibility at every level. Except one, Lauren. Ethan said, quietly, tapping a spreadsheet on his screen. This is where the structure gets interesting. I leaned forward. What am I looking at? These are transaction approval sequences, he explained. Every major fund movement required 2 levels of digital verification. I frowned. That's standard. Yes, he said, but look closely. He zoomed in. There were 2 authorization columns, one labeled Executive Approval Me, the second labeled Compliance Verification, and under that column, every single entry bore the same name, Margaret E. Whitmore, Daniel's mother. I felt something tighten in my chest. She verified all of them. Yes, Ethan said, which means legally she certified the legitimacy of each transaction. I stared at the screen because that detail shifted everything. Daniel hadn't just acted alone. His mother had been actively involved, which meant the scheme wasn't just a marital betrayal. It was coordinated, professional, corporate, and that opened a completely different legal pathway. Ethan leaned back. If we can prove she knowingly approved fraudulent transfers, he said this becomes a conspiracy case. That changes how regulators approach everything. Conspiracy. The word felt heavy. Not emotionally, strategically. Because conspiracy cases don't just assign blame. They dismantle entire networks. I exhaled slowly. So we need proof. She knew the transfers were illegitimate. Exactly. And where would that proof be? Ethan didn't hesitate. Private communications, which brought us back to the same problem. Access. Because while the USB drive contained planning documents, it didn't contain anything directly tying Margaret Whitmore to fraudulent intent. Only participation. And participation alone wasn't enough. We needed evidence of knowledge, evidence of coordination, evidence that they understood exactly what they were doing. I rubbed my temples. Daniel wouldn't leave something that obvious lying around. Ethan gave me a small, knowing look. People who believe they're smarter than everyone else always do, he said. I met his eyes. What do you mean? He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was a technical manual, the same home network system Daniel had installed. Ethan tapped a section labeled Data Synchronization Logs. This system doesn't just back up files, he explained. It logs device access connection timestamps and internal messaging between linked devices. My pulse slowed, meaning if Daniel and his mother had communicated through the home network system, there would be records, even if the messages themselves were deleted. Ethan nodded as if reading my thoughts. Metadata alone could establish coordination timelines, he said. I leaned back, processing, because this wasn't just about finding a smoking gun. It was about constructing a timeline, a pattern, a narrative strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. But there was still a massive obstacle. Accessing the backup server. It was encrypted, password protected, and likely monitored. Ethan closed his laptop. Lauren, he said carefully, I need to ask you something. I looked up. Did Daniel ever reuse passwords? Anything personal? Dates, habits, patterns? I thought back. Daniel was disciplined, structured, almost obsessive about security. But then a small memory surfaced. Something trivial, or at least it had seemed trivial at the time. 2 years earlier, when we were setting up a shared streaming account, Daniel had laughed and said something I never forgot. I always use the same base password, he'd said casually. It's efficient. Just tweak it for different systems. At the time, I hadn't cared. Now that offhand comment felt like a door cracking open. I leaned forward slowly. I might know where to start. Ethan's eyes sharpened. Tell me. I explained the pattern I remembered. How Daniel often built passwords around one specific date. The date his first company failed, September 18th. The day he claimed had taught him everything about never losing control again. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded once. That's not just a password pattern, he said quietly. That's psychology. He leaned forward. People like Daniel anchor their security habits around defining moments. It gives them a sense of control. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Because for the first time since all of this began, Daniel didn't feel untouchable. He felt predictable. That night back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and stared at the login interface for the cloud backup system. My fingers hovered over the keyboard because this wasn't just a technical step. It was a line. Once I crossed it, there was no going back to being the passive victim of his plan. I would be actively fighting, strategically, deliberately, silently. If you were in my position right then, knowing one password might expose everything, would you hesitate? Or would you type it immediately? I didn't hesitate. I entered the date, then added the variations I remembered Daniel using. On the third attempt, the screen changed. Access granted. My heart didn't race. It slowed into something cold, because what appeared next wasn't just a list of files. It was an archive, hundreds of folders, years of stored network data. Everything Daniel believed was private. Everything he thought was secure. Everything he assumed I would never see. And as I opened the first synchronization log, one entry immediately caught my attention. A communication session between Daniel Whitmore's device and Margaret Whitmore's device. Timestamped 5 days before I signed the share transfer agreement. The session duration, 2 hours and 16 minutes. And attached to the log was a file labeled simply, Liability Strategy, Final Version. In that moment, I realized something chilling. The proof I needed might already exist, waiting, hidden in plain sight, inside a system Daniel himself had built. 5 weeks before the Series B launch event, at exactly 11:28 p.m., with my apartment lit only by the glow of my laptop and the hum of a cheap window AC unit, I opened the file labeled Liability Strategy, Final Version. The document was 47 pages long, dense, technical, written in the kind of precise legal language designed not to be easily misunderstood or easily traced. My hands didn't shake as I scrolled, because by then, something fundamental inside me had changed. I wasn't reading as a wife, or even as a victim. I was reading like a strategist, studying an opponent's playbook. And within the first 2 pages, I found exactly what we needed. A section titled Executive Exposure Mitigation. Beneath it was a step-by-step outline. Step 1. Secure majority ownership through spousal transfer. Step 2. Implement delegated financial authority structure. Step 3. Execute controlled fund movements under executive authorization. Step 4. Initiate regulatory scrutiny through anonymous reporting. I stopped breathing for a moment. Anonymous reporting. Daniel hadn't just prepared for an investigation. He had triggered it. He had deliberately created the conditions for regulators to look at fleet access, but only after positioning me as the legally responsible party. I kept reading. The next section was even colder. Step 5. Public Leadership Transition Announcement. Step 6. Formal disclosure of financial irregularities attributed to prior executive management. Step 7. Reputation containment and investor reassurance strategy. This wasn't a betrayal. It was an execution plan, carefully staged, legally insulated, and designed to destroy me in phases. I leaned back slowly, letting the reality settle in, because this was the first piece of evidence that proved intent beyond doubt. Not just to take control, but to frame me, strategically, deliberately, systematically. And then I saw the final section, the one that made my pulse slow into something dangerously calm. It was titled Contingency Risk Emotional Reaction Scenario. Daniel had anticipated how I might respond. There was a list. If Lauren Carter contests legally, delay proceedings through arbitration. If Lauren Carter attempts public defense, pre-release narrative to media. If Lauren Carter seeks regulatory cooperation, present documented executive authorizations. And at the bottom, a single line written in Margaret Whitmore's unmistakable formal tone. Subject lacks the psychological profile for sustained strategic retaliation. I stared at that sentence for a long time, because it wasn't just an assessment. It was a miscalculation, and miscalculations are where plans collapse. I saved copies of everything, encrypted them, backed them up to 3 separate drives. Then I called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me you found something," he said. "I found everything," I replied quietly. There was a long pause as I summarized the document. When I finished, Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's conspiracy evidence," he said. "Clear intent coordination and planning." "Yes, but Lauren," his voice dropped, "this changes the stakes. How, if we bring this directly to regulators now?" He said Daniel will pivot immediately. He'll claim it's hypothetical planning, legal strategy, not proof of executed wrongdoing. I frowned, but it shows intent. Intent alone isn't enough, Ethan said. We need proof the plan was actually implemented exactly as described, which meant we needed confirmation of the anonymous report, the trigger that started the SEC investigation. I opened the document again. There was a subsection labeled Reporting Mechanism. Inside was a reference to a third-party compliance hotline used by multiple regulatory agencies. And next to it, a date, the exact date the SEC investigation had been initiated. 6 weeks earlier, the same week, Daniel publicly announced our divorce. I felt a cold clarity settle over me because that timeline confirmed something critical. Daniel had synchronized everything. The investigation, the takeover, the public announcement, all aligned perfectly. But one question remained. Who had actually filed the anonymous report? Because if we could identify that, we could prove execution, not just intent. And that would collapse the entire liability structure he built. I asked Ethan the same question. His answer came immediately. Anonymous reports aren't truly anonymous, he said. They leave metadata trails. Can we access them? Not directly, he replied. But there's another way. I waited. He continued carefully. Most corporate compliance hotlines route through third-party vendors. Those vendors log submission IP addresses. My mind began connecting the dots. If the report was filed from Daniel's home network, I said slowly, then the metadata would match the network system you accessed. Ethan finished. Silence filled the line. Because we both understood what that meant. The proof we needed was likely already in the network logs, but buried, hidden among thousands of entries. And time was running out. The Series B event was now only 32 days away. I closed my eyes briefly, because for the first time, since all of this began, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger, momentum. Daniel had spent years planning every step, but he had also documented every step. And documentation creates trails. That night, I began searching the network logs for the specific date of the anonymous report. Hour by hour, minute by minute, thousands of entries, device connections, data transmissions, encrypted communications. It took 4 hours before I found it. A single outbound encrypted submission, time-stamped at 1:12 a.m., originating from Daniel Whitmore's personal device. Destination Compliance Reporting Portal. My breath left me slowly, because this was it. The direct link. The execution of the plan. The moment he crossed from strategy into action. But as I examined the log more closely, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There was a second device connected to the network during that same submission window. A device ID I didn't recognize. Registered under a name I had never seen before. User K. Reynolds. The connection lasted only 9 minutes. Then disappeared completely. No further activity. No prior history. No future logins. A ghost connection, which meant one of two things. Either someone else had been present in the house that night, or someone had remotely accessed the network with authorization. And the identity behind that device was something Daniel had never mentioned, which raised a new unsettling question. Because if there was a third party involved in triggering the investigation, then Daniel's plan wasn't just a family conspiracy. It was bigger, much bigger. And whoever K. Reynolds was, they had been inside the system at the exact moment everything began. 27 days before the Series B launch event at exactly 7:05 p.m., while a thunderstorm rolled over Austin and rain streaked against my apartment window, I sat completely still, staring at a single line on my laptop screen. User K. Reynolds. Connection duration, 9 minutes, 12 seconds. Timestamp, 1:12 a.m. The exact moment the anonymous SEC report had been submitted from Daniel's home network. For a long time, I didn't move, because something inside me had shifted again. Up until that moment, everything had felt like a two-sided battle. Me, Daniel, but this entry confirmed something far more complicated. There had been a third player, someone present at the origin point of the plan, someone whose identity Daniel had never once mentioned. And that meant one thing. There was a part of his strategy I still didn't understand. If you discovered that the person who destroyed your life wasn't acting alone, and that someone else had quietly helped set the trap, what would you do first? Look for revenge, or try to understand why that person was involved at all? Because that question changed how I approached everything next. I didn't tell Ethan immediately. Instead, I did something Daniel would never expect. I went silent, completely silent. No calls, no messages, no visible activity. I stopped asking questions publicly, stopped responding to legal notices beyond the minimum required. From the outside, it looked exactly like what Daniel and his mother had predicted. Withdrawal, defeat, emotional collapse. And that illusion became my greatest advantage. Because while they believed I was fading out of the fight, I was studying them more closely than ever. 3 days later, I drove to a quiet cafe near Fleet Axis headquarters. Not to meet anyone, just to observe, because Daniel's daily routines had always followed patterns. Same morning coffee order, same gym schedule, same work hours. Control was his comfort zone. And people who rely on control become predictable when they think they've already won. I sat by the window and watched the entrance to the office building across the street. At 8:47 a.m., Daniel arrived. Right on schedule, he stepped out of his car, looking exactly the way he always had polished. Confident, completely composed. But something was different. He wasn't alone. A woman exited the passenger side. Late 20s, professional attire, dark hair pulled back. She walked beside him, speaking quietly, holding a tablet. Not an assistant, not an investor, someone closer to his operational circle. I didn't recognize her, but something about her presence felt deliberate. Because Daniel didn't casually allow new people into his inner workflow, especially during sensitive corporate transitions. I watched as they entered the building together. And for the first time since discovering the network logs, a thought surfaced. K. Reynolds. Initials. KR. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was a direction. I stayed there for another hour, reviewing everything I knew about Daniel's hiring patterns. He favored candidates with legal or financial backgrounds. People who could operate quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. And then I remembered something small. 2 months before the anniversary party, Daniel had mentioned bringing in a special compliance consultant. He had said it casually, briefly. Just one sentence over dinner. She's helping streamline internal reporting systems. At the time, I barely registered it. Now, it felt like a missing puzzle piece, clicking into place. Because if this consultant had access to compliance systems, she would have been perfectly positioned to file the anonymous SEC report. And if she had also been connected to the home network system, she could be the mysterious K. Reynolds. I didn't confront anyone, didn't investigate openly. Instead, I did something much more effective. I waited, because patience creates visibility. 3 days later, Ethan called me. His voice was unusually tense. "Lauren," he said, "there is something you need to know." "What happened?" "I've been reviewing internal Fleet Axis organizational changes," he said. "There was a new executive-level hire added to compliance oversight 2 months ago." My pulse slowed. Name, Catherine Reynolds. There it was. Confirmation. But Ethan's next words hit harder. "She wasn't hired directly by Daniel," he said. "She was recommended by Margaret Whitmore." A cold understanding settled over me. This wasn't just a consultant. She was part of the architecture, carefully placed inside the system to ensure the plan executed smoothly. I closed my eyes briefly, because this revealed something crucial. Daniel and his mother hadn't just built legal protections. They had installed human safeguards, people positioned to trigger specific steps at precise times. And that meant Catherine Reynolds wasn't just a witness. She was a participant, a key one. But here's what made my mind shift into a different kind of stillness. Because participation creates vulnerability. Anyone involved in a conspiracy carries risk. Legal risk, reputational risk, career-ending risk. Which meant Catherine Reynolds wasn't untouchable. She was exposed. The next evening, while reviewing network logs again, I noticed something new. Her device ID appeared only once more after the initial submission night. A short connection. 5 minutes. 2 weeks later. The timestamp aligned with another event. The day after Daniel publicly announced our divorce, which meant she had returned to the network system. not to initiate, but to verify, to confirm the plan had advanced. And then she disappeared entirely from the logs. No further activity, no continued connection, as if her role had ended. That realization shifted my thinking again. Because if Catherine Reynolds's involvement was limited to those 2 points, then her participation had been transactional, specific, contained, which meant something very important. She might not be loyal to Daniel. She might simply be protecting herself. And people motivated by self-preservation can become the most powerful allies if approached correctly. But approaching her directly would be dangerous. It could alert Daniel, collapse any advantage I had. So instead, I chose silence again. Strategic silence. Because sometimes the most effective move isn't confrontation. It's letting someone wonder whether you already know. And 2 days later, something happened that confirmed this strategy was working. I received an email from an unknown address. No subject line, no greeting, just one sentence. Some plans don't end the way they're designed to. Attached was a single file, a calendar screenshot. Daniel Whitmore's private schedule. Highlighted in red was the date of the Series B launch event. And beneath it, a note in his own handwriting. Final narrative lock. KR confirmation. I stared at the screen for a long time because this meant one thing. Catherine Reynolds wasn't just involved. She had access to Daniel's private communications, and she had just reached out to me, silently, indirectly, which raised a question that changed everything. Was she warning me or testing me? And more importantly, why would someone who helped build the trap now risk contacting the person inside it? 22 days before the Series B launch event at exactly 11:56 p.m., with the city outside my window unusually quiet and my phone face down on the table, I opened the anonymous email for the 15th time and reread the single sentence. Some plans don't end the way they're designed to. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't apologetic. It was measured, professional, almost clinical. The kind of message written by someone who understood risk and was trying to minimize it. I didn't reply, not immediately, because responding too quickly would reveal something Daniel's entire strategy depended on, that I was still reacting emotionally. Instead, I waited 6 hours, then 12, then a full 24. Strategic silence again, because silence creates pressure. It forces the other person to reveal more. And at 9:08 p.m. the next evening, another message arrived. Same anonymous address. This time, there was the subject line. Timing matters. Inside was a single question. Do you understand why you were chosen? I stared at the screen, because that question wasn't asking whether I knew what had happened. It was asking whether I understood the logic behind it. And that meant one thing. Catherine Reynolds wasn't reaching out to help me emotionally. She was testing my awareness, evaluating whether I saw the full structure of Daniel's plan. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked myself the same question. Why me? Not just because I trusted Daniel, not just because I signed documents. There had to be a deeper reason, a strategic reason. And as I reviewed everything again, the acquisition strategy, the liability structure, the SEC investigation timeline, something clicked. Something Daniel and his mother had calculated with terrifying precision. I wasn't just convenient. I was ideal, young enough to be perceived as inexperienced, successful enough to appear ambitious, and visible enough that if a scandal surfaced, the narrative would be believable. A founder who grew too fast and lost control. A story the media would accept instantly because it fit an existing pattern. That realization settled in like ice. I finally replied to the email. One sentence, because I was the most credible scapegoat. The response came 6 minutes later. Yes, no emotion, no elaboration, just confirmation. And then another message appeared. Do you also understand why the timing was critical? I didn't hesitate this time. I typed, the Series B funding round. A pause. Then, yes. A fraud disclosure before funding collapses valuation. A fraud disclosure after leadership transition preserves it. I leaned back slowly because that was the coldest part of the entire plan. Daniel wasn't just trying to remove me. He was protecting the company's valuation, protecting investor confidence, ensuring Fleet Access could still attract tens of millions in new funding. Even after the scandal, he hadn't destroyed the company. He had optimized it at my expense. The next message appeared. You see the full picture. I didn't respond. Instead, I waited, because now the real question was emerging. Why was she telling me this? 3 minutes later, she answered it herself. I need to know whether you intend to escalate before the event. My pulse slowed. This wasn't curiosity. It was risk assessment. She wasn't asking as an ally. She was asking as someone who needed to protect herself, which meant she was vulnerable, and vulnerability creates leverage. If you were in my position right then, would you threaten exposure immediately? Or would you let the other person reveal how afraid they really were? I chose the second. I typed, "What do you think will happen if I do?" The reply took longer this time, almost 2 minutes. When it came, it was the first message that showed any hint of urgency. Daniel will accelerate narrative control. Media releases are already drafted. You would be portrayed as unstable and retaliatory. That was exactly what the contingency plan had described, which meant she wasn't speculating. She was confirming. I typed another question. What about you? There was a long pause, long enough that I wondered if she would respond at all. Then finally, a single sentence appeared. I was contracted to ensure procedural compliance, not to participate in criminal liability. There it was, the line she had drawn. Not loyalty, self-preservation. I understood instantly. She wasn't reaching out because she cared about me. She was reaching out because she realized something Daniel had miscalculated. If his plan collapsed, she would be legally exposed too. And that meant she needed something from me. Assurance, timing, coordination. I leaned forward slowly because this was the first real shift in power since everything began. Not revenge, not confrontation, influence. I typed carefully. Then, you know the plan isn't finished. Her reply came immediately. No, Phase 3 requires confirmation of narrative acceptance, which meant something very specific. Daniel needed public perception locked in at the Series B event before moving to final legal containment. The event wasn't just an announcement. It was the keystone, the moment where everything became irreversible. I stared at the screen because that realization created a completely new strategy. If the keystone could be disrupted, the entire structure could collapse, but timing would be everything. Too early, and Daniel would adapt. Too late, and his narrative would solidify. I typed one final message. I won't move before the event. The typing indicator appeared immediately, then stopped, then appeared again. When her reply finally came, it was just 3 words. Then be ready. No explanation, no goodbye. The email thread went silent after that. I closed my laptop and sat back in the dim light of my apartment because something inside me had settled into a new kind of stillness. Not fear, not anger, preparation. Daniel believed the Series B event would be the final step in eliminating me. But now, I understood something he didn't. That event wasn't just his final move. It was his point of maximum exposure. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't thinking about survival anymore. I was thinking about timing, because the most effective retaliation isn't loud, it's precise. And 22 days from now, Daniel Whitmore was planning to stand in front of 300 people and declare his version of the truth. He just didn't know yet that by the time he stepped onto that stage, I would already have everything in place to dismantle it. Quietly, completely, in a way he could never reverse. 14 days before the Series B launch event at exactly 8:32 a.m., while I sat in a quiet conference room in a mid-tier law office building in Dallas and watched a digital recorder count seconds in red numbers, I slid a printed document across the table to the woman sitting opposite me. Catherine Ann Reynolds, 31 years old, compliance consultant, and the silent third architect of the trap that had nearly destroyed my life. She didn't touch the document right away. Instead, she looked at me the way analysts study a risk variable carefully, without emotion. "I wasn't expecting you to request an in-person meeting," she said calmly. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was something beneath it. Tension, controlled, which meant one thing. She was afraid. Not of me, of what I already knew. I leaned back in my chair. "I wasn't expecting to need one," I replied. Silence settled between us. Because this wasn't a confrontation. It was a negotiation. And both of us understood that. If you found yourself sitting across from someone who helped set the trap that ruined your life, would you start with anger or with clarity about what they stand to lose? I chose clarity. I tapped the document. "You verified $12 million in transfers," I said quietly. "You were present when the SEC report was submitted, and you have access to Daniel Whitmore's internal communication systems." She finally looked down at the paper. It wasn't a threat letter. It wasn't an accusation. It was a timeline. Every documented action linked to her device ID. Network logs, authorization records, metadata trails. Not emotional, not dramatic, just facts. Her jaw tightened slightly. "That doesn't prove criminal intent," she said. "No," I agreed calmly. "But it establishes participation, which is enough to make you a co-subject in a federal investigation." Her eyes flicked up to mine. For the first time, there was something visible there. Not fear, exactly. Calculation. She understood the position she was in. And more importantly, she understood I knew it. "I was contracted for procedural compliance," she repeated more quietly this time. "I know," I said, "which is why we're having this conversation instead of a subpoena hearing." That shifted the dynamic, because now the question wasn't whether she was exposed. It was whether she had a way out. I folded my hands. "Daniel believes you're loyal," I continued. "But you're not. You're protecting yourself." She didn't deny it, because denial would be pointless. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want?" The directness of it almost made me respect her, because this wasn't about apologies or morality. It was about leverage. I answered just as directly. "Testimony." Her expression didn't change, but the silence that followed said everything. Because testimony wasn't just cooperation. It was irreversible, career-ending, life-altering. "You understand what you're asking," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "And you understand what Daniel will do if he suspects." "He already suspects nothing," I interrupted calmly, because he believes his psychological profile assessment was correct. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I knew exactly what she was thinking. The same sentence I had read in the liability strategy. Subject lacks the psychological profile for sustained strategic retaliation. I let the silence stretch, because sometimes silence says more than any argument. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "You waited," she said. "Yes." "You didn't react publicly." "No." "You let him believe the narrative was working." "Yes." She studied me for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "That changes things." I didn't respond, because I already knew it did. She leaned forward slightly. "Daniel's final step isn't just the public announcement," she said. "It's the investor confidence certification immediately afterward." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It's a private session," she explained. 30 minutes after the main presentation. Only major investors and regulatory observers. He plans to formally attribute all irregularities to prior executive leadership you. My chest felt tight for a moment, not from fear, from the precision of his cruelty. He wasn't just planning to remove me publicly. He was planning to lock the narrative legally, before I could respond, before regulators could hear anything else. But Catherine continued. "And once that certification is signed," she said, "it becomes the official record attached to the Series B filing." That was the keystone. Not the public speech, the private certification, the moment the story would become permanent. I leaned back slowly. because now everything was clearer than ever. Daniel hadn't built one trap. He had built two. The first, for public perception. The second, for legal finality. And both would activate within the same hour. I met her gaze. "Then that's where it ends," I said quietly. She didn't ask what I meant, because she already understood. The real battle wasn't the speech. It was the certification. That's where truth would either be buried or exposed. A long silence passed. Then she said something that shifted everything. "There's one problem." "What?" She hesitated for the first time. Not long, just enough to show the weight of what she was about to reveal. "Daniel isn't the only one who needs that certification," she said. My pulse slowed. "What do you mean?" She held my gaze. "The investors require it to release funding." I nodded. "That makes sense." "Yes," she said. "But there's another reason." I waited, and then she said the words that changed the scale of the entire situation. "Because Fleet Access isn't just attracting venture capital anymore." I felt something cold move through me. "Who else is involved?" I asked quietly. Her voice dropped. "Federal transportation contracts." The room felt suddenly smaller, because that meant something very different. It meant government interest, national infrastructure, high-level scrutiny, which explained why the SEC had moved so quickly, and why Daniel's strategy had been so meticulous. He wasn't just protecting investors. He was protecting eligibility for federal contracts worth hundreds of millions. If a fraud scandal hit after those contracts were awarded, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just for him, for everyone involved. That was the real reason the narrative needed to be locked down. Not just for reputation, for access, for power, for money on a completely different scale. I sat there, absorbing that, because this wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. It was corporate warfare, and Daniel had escalated it far beyond what I had imagined. Catherine finally spoke again. "If you expose everything publicly before the certification," she said, "it will trigger immediate federal review." I looked at her steadily. "That's exactly why he believes I won't do it." She didn't answer, because she knew I was right. Daniel believed I would protect the company I built, even at my own expense. He believed my loyalty to Fleet Access would prevent me from detonating the entire structure. And for months, he had been right. But now, I understood something he didn't. Fleet Access wasn't the company I built anymore. It had already been weaponized against me. And if a structure is built on fraud, letting it stand doesn't protect it. It ensures it collapses later, more violently. I leaned forward. "Testimony," I said again quietly. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not loyalty, not trust, acceptance. "Then we do this precisely," she said. "Exactly when the certification begins." I nodded, because timing was everything. And the Series B event was no longer Daniel's final move. It was about to become his point of no return. 7 days before the Series B launch event, at exactly 3:17 p.m., while I sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Dallas and watched 3 federal investigators review a printed transcript line by line, I realized something that made my hands go completely still. Daniel Whitmore had never once planned for this scenario. Not because he wasn't careful, not because he wasn't strategic, but because he had built his entire plan around one fixed assumption: that I would never cooperate with regulators in a way that risked damaging Fleet Access. And for months, he had been right, but he never accounted for one critical shift. The moment I stopped thinking of Fleet Access as my company and started seeing it as a system he had already corrupted. Across the table, Special Agent Daniel Reeves removed his glasses and leaned back slowly. "This is extensive," he said. His tone wasn't surprised. It was controlled, measured. The way professionals speak when they understand the scale of what they're looking at. Beside him, a forensic analyst continued scrolling through digital logs, network synchronization records, authorization metadata, internal strategy documents. Everything we had assembled over the past 3 weeks. Carefully, methodically, without alerting Daniel, without triggering any premature action. Reeves looked at me again. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "you understand what happens once we proceed with this." I met his gaze steadily. "Yes, federal intervention will be immediate," he continued. "Funding processes will halt. Corporate leadership will face investigation." I didn't respond because I already knew. And more importantly, I had accepted it. If you were in my position, knowing that exposing the truth would likely freeze the company you built for years, would you still do it? That was the question I had wrestled with for days. But the answer had become clear. Daniel had already destroyed the integrity of Fleet Axis. All I was doing now was preventing him from profiting from that destruction. Reeves nodded once. "Then we move forward," he said. He tapped a folder in front of him. "There is one final step." My pulse slowed. "What?" "We need real-time confirmation during the event," he said. "Specifically during the investor certification session. Because that session was the legal keystone. The moment Daniel intended to permanently seal his narrative." Reeves continued, "Once he initiates formal certification, we will intervene." I leaned back slowly, because hearing it stated so plainly made the reality feel heavier. This wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational, strategic, irreversible. The Series B event would become the moment everything collapsed. Not quietly, not privately, publicly. Exactly the way Daniel had intended for me. Only now, the direction would be reversed. Later that evening, I drove past the Four Seasons Ballroom, where the event would take place. Workers were already setting up staging equipment. Large banners with the Fleet Axis logo hung near the entrance. I watched from across the street, sitting inside my car, as twilight settled over the city. Because this location, this exact building, would become the center of everything. The place Daniel planned to finalize his victory, and the place where his entire structure would unravel. A strange calm settled over me. Not triumph, not anticipation, just stillness, because the outcome was no longer uncertain. Only the timing remained. 2 days later, Catherine Reynolds called me for the first time. Not through anonymous email, directly. Her voice was quiet, controlled. "The certification schedule has been finalized," she said. When I asked, 37 minutes after the public presentation begins. I nodded. "And Daniel, he's confident," she said simply. Of course he was. He believed every variable was under control. He believed his narrative would unfold exactly as planned. And most importantly, he believed I would be present in the audience. Silent, defeated, powerless. Catherine hesitated briefly. Then she said something unexpected. "He still talks about you." I frowned slightly. "What does he say?" Her voice remained neutral. "He says you were brilliant, but predictable." I didn't react outwardly, but inside, something settled into an even deeper stillness. Because predictability had been the foundation of his entire plan. He believed he understood my psychology completely, and that belief was about to become his greatest vulnerability. The day before the event, I received the final legal briefing, a simple document outlining the sequence of intervention. No dramatic language, no emotional tone, just a clear timeline. Public presentation begins. Investor certification session initiates. Formal declarations made. Federal investigators enter. Evidence presented. Immediate suspension of certification proceedings. Detention of primary subjects. I read it once, then closed the folder. Because there was nothing left to analyze, nothing left to prepare. Everything had already been set into motion. That night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, from awareness. Because I knew something Daniel didn't. That tomorrow, he would stand in front of hundreds of people, believing he was in complete control. He would speak calmly, confidently, as he always did. He would present his version of the story. And for a brief moment, it would appear he had won, until the exact second when that illusion shattered. Not through emotion, not through confrontation, through evidence, precise, undeniable, irreversible. And as I lay in the darkness of my apartment, staring at the ceiling, one final realization settled over me. Daniel had spent years engineering a perfect trap. Every document, every timeline, every narrative layer designed to ensure I would fall with no way to fight back. But in the end, the same precision that made his plan so powerful had also made it fragile. Because the more carefully a system is engineered, the more completely it collapses when its hidden foundation is exposed. And tomorrow, at exactly the moment Daniel believed his victory would become permanent, that foundation would be revealed to everyone watching in a way he could never recover from. On the night of the Series B launch event, at exactly 7:42 p.m., beneath stage lights, worth more than the first car I ever owned, and in front of 312 investors, reporters, and executives seated in perfect rows, my husband stepped to the podium and smiled the same calm, controlled smile he had worn the night he publicly divorced me. In his hand was a black folder. Inside it was the certification document that would have permanently sealed my reputation as a fraud. And for the first 10 minutes of his speech, everything unfolded exactly the way he had planned. He spoke smoothly, confidently, every word measured, every pause intentional. Fleet Access has reached a pivotal milestone, Daniel Whitmore said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. Tonight marks the beginning of a new era of leadership stability and investor confidence. Applause rippled through the audience. Not enthusiastic, professional, expected. He continued shifting seamlessly into the narrative he had prepared months in advance. Over the past year, the company experienced internal financial irregularities tied to prior executive oversight. He didn't say my name yet. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew, because he had spent weeks preparing them. Quietly, strategically, repetition through private conversations, investor briefings, media whispers. By the time he spoke those words publicly, the story already felt familiar, believable. That was his true skill. Not creating lies, but creating narratives that sounded like truth. If you had been sitting in that ballroom, hearing him speak so calmly, so convincingly, would you have doubted him, or would you have accepted what sounded like a logical corporate transition? Because that's exactly how it felt in that moment. Controlled, orderly, final. Then he said my name. Lauren Carter's contributions to Fleet Access were foundational, he said smoothly. However, leadership requires accountability, and when irregularities emerge, responsibility must follow. The room was completely silent now, every eye fixed on him. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't emotional. He was positioning himself as reasonable, measured, reluctantly forced into action. That was the second layer of his strategy. First, establish the narrative. Second, claim moral authority. He closed the black folder. Tonight, he said we move forward with transparency, stability, and renewed confidence. Applause began again, stronger this time, because people were responding to certainty, to closure, to the feeling that a problem had been resolved. And at that moment, Daniel Whitmore believed he had succeeded, because he couldn't see what was happening just beyond the ballroom doors. He couldn't see the federal investigators waiting in a secured corridor. He couldn't see the legal observers reviewing final confirmation signals. And he couldn't see me, standing quietly near the back entrance, exactly where Catherine Reynolds had told me to be, hidden in plain sight. Calm, silent, waiting. Daniel moved to the next phase. Following this presentation, he continued, "We will conduct a private investor certification session to formally conclude this transition." There it was, the keystone, the moment his entire structure depended on. He smiled again, that calm, confident expression that had once made me feel safe. Then he said the words that marked the exact point of no return. Fleet Access is entering its strongest era yet. That's when the ballroom doors opened. Not dramatically, not violently, quietly, methodically. 4 federal agents entered first, then 2 legal officers, Then, Special Agent Daniel Reeves. They didn't rush. They didn't raise their voices. They simply walked forward with controlled precision. The applause faded instantly. Confusion spread across the room, like a ripple. Daniel stopped speaking mid-sentence. His expression didn't change immediately, because at first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. But then, Reeves stepped forward. "Daniel Whitmore," he said clearly, his voice calm but unmistakable. "This event is now subject to federal investigative intervention." Silence fell so completely that the hum of stage lighting became audible. Daniel blinked once, just once. Then his composure returned, because denial was his first instinct. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "This is a private corporate event." Reeves didn't react. He simply handed him a document. "This is a formal notice of investigation regarding coordinated financial misconduct and conspiracy to commit fraud." For the first time, Daniel's hand hesitated, only slightly, but enough. Enough for everyone watching to see. And that tiny hesitation marked the exact moment his certainty cracked. He tried to recover. "Lauren Carter is the responsible executive," he said quickly, shifting into the narrative he had prepared. "All authorizations bear her." "That is incorrect," Reeves interrupted calmly. He turned slightly, and in that moment, every head in the ballroom turned with him, toward the back entrance, toward me. I stepped forward, slowly. Not dramatically, not angrily, just steady, controlled. Because this wasn't a confrontation. It was a revelation. Daniel's eyes locked onto mine. And for the first time since all of this began, I saw something he had never allowed himself to show. Not anger, not disbelief. Fear. Real, unmistakable fear. Reeves continued. "Evidence obtained through network data logs, internal communications, and witness testimony indicates a coordinated strategy to transfer liability to Miss Carter while executing unauthorized financial movements." The room erupted into whispers. Investors exchanged stunned glances. Media representatives began typing furiously. Daniel's mother, seated near the front, went completely still, her face pale, controlled, but no longer confident. Daniel tried one last pivot. "This is retaliation," he said sharply. "She's attempting to damage the company after losing control." "No," I said quietly. My voice carried clearly through the silent room. "This is accountability." He looked at me like he didn't recognize me, because in a way, he didn't. I held his gaze and said the one sentence that ended his narrative completely. "You built a perfect trap, Daniel." I paused, then finished calmly. "But you forgot one thing." His jaw tightened. "What he demanded." I met his eyes steadily. "Every system leaves a record." Reeves signaled to the agents. They stepped forward, and as they did, Daniel Whitmore's final stage began. The stage every manipulator eventually reaches. First denial, then blame, then the moment when control collapses. And as the agents approached him, I saw it happen in real time. His composure didn't shatter loudly. It didn't explode. It dissolved, quietly, irreversibly, exactly the way his plan had been designed to destroy me. 6 months after the night federal agents walked into that ballroom on a quiet Sunday morning at exactly 6:18 a.m., while I sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking Lady Bird Lake with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, I realized something surprising. For the first time in years, my life felt completely still. Not empty, not lonely, just calm. The kind of calm that only exists after a long storm has fully passed. Because everything that followed the Series B event had unfolded with a precision Daniel Whitmore himself would have appreciated. Only this time, he wasn't the one in control. Within 48 hours of the intervention, federal authorities froze all fleet access executive decision-making. The Series B funding round, valued at $62 million, was immediately suspended. News spread quickly, not as rumors, as verified facts. Internal strategy documents, network logs, financial authorization trails, and most importantly, testimony. Catherine Reynolds's testimony. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, exact, and devastating. She described the planning meetings, the liability strategy sessions, the deliberate timing of the anonymous report, the coordination between Daniel and Margaret Whitmore. Every step, every decision, every calculated risk. Her statements didn't just support the evidence. They completed it. Daniel's legal team tried every defense they could construct. First denial, then deflection, then the argument that all planning had been hypothetical corporate strategy. But the network metadata logs destroyed that claim because they showed execution, not theory. And once execution was proven, the entire structure collapsed, exactly as Ethan predicted. Margaret Whitmore resigned from her law firm within 2 weeks. Her professional reputation, built over 30 years, disintegrated almost overnight. Catherine Reynolds entered a federal cooperation agreement. She lost her consulting license, but avoided criminal charges. Daniel Whitmore faced the full weight of the consequences he had spent years trying to transfer onto me. Conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, and perhaps the most devastating outcome for him, permanent exclusion from executive leadership eligibility in any federally contracted industry, which meant the one thing he valued above everything else, control, was gone. Completely, irreversibly. Fleet Access itself survived, but not in the form Daniel had envisioned. The board underwent restructuring. Federal oversight remained in place for nearly a year. And when operations finally stabilized, they asked me to return, not as a founder, not as a victim, as an independent strategic advisor. I accepted on one condition: no executive authority, no ownership stake, just boundaries. Clear, non-negotiable, because I had learned something far more important than how to win. I had learned how to walk away. If you had spent years building something only to watch it be weaponized against you, would you try to reclaim it? Or would you choose peace instead? For me, the answer became clear the moment I signed the advisory contract. I wasn't returning to Fleet Access to rebuild my past. I was returning to ensure it never became a weapon again. Daniel and I never spoke after the trial. Not once. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic closure, just silence. And strangely, that silence felt like the most complete ending possible. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like distance, like boundaries, like indifference. 3 months ago, I started a new company. Small, quiet, focused on cybersecurity compliance systems for startups. The irony isn't lost on me. I now help founders protect themselves from exactly the kind of internal vulnerabilities Daniel exploited. Last week, one of my clients asked me a question during a consultation. How do you know when someone you trust is manipulating you? I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Then, I told her the one sentence that now sits framed on my office wall. Trust is never the problem. Blind trust is. It's simple, but it's the lesson that cost me nearly everything to learn. And the strange thing is, I don't hate Daniel anymore. Hate requires emotional energy, and he no longer deserves any. What I feel instead is something quieter. Clarity, because in the end, he didn't lose because I outplayed him emotionally. He lost because he misunderstood something fundamental. He believed control came from predicting people, from calculating reactions, from designing systems where outcomes were predetermined. But what he never understood is that people change. Pressure changes them. Betrayal changes them. And once someone stops reacting emotionally and starts thinking strategically, every prediction becomes useless. That's what destroyed his plan. Not luck, not timing, just one simple shift. I stopped being predictable. As the sun rose slowly over the lake, light reflecting off the water in soft, steady ripples, I took a deep breath and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not satisfaction. Peace, real peace. Because justice doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like closure. quiet, complete. And as I sat there watching the morning unfold, I realized something else. This story wasn't really about revenge. It was about boundaries, about knowing when to fight and knowing when to let go. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone tried to erase it, tell me in the comments, because stories like ours matter. They remind us that control is temporary, but resilience is permanent. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, and stay with me, because the next story I'll share is about something even more chilling. What happens when the person who betrays you is someone you never even knew was watching?